Welcome back to a special edition of the Converge podcast, Election 24. Today on the Converge podcast, which helps you understand how to live as a Christian in a post-Christian society, we're going to be answering questions that we fielded on basically just the issue of who do we vote for, how do we vote, is voting necessary, how do politics and Christianity intersect for the life of discipleship, for the life of the Christian. How should a Christian view politics in this current cultural war that we're in?
Yep. It's that time of year. It's that every 4 years comes around. People are asking lots of questions about Christianity and politics, so we put it out there on our social media. Send us your questions. We know people have been wondering a few things, so we're just going to go through the questions and talk about them, and that's going to be our podcast.
All right, and so the first question we're going to cover, we're just going to go ahead and get this one out of the way. Should we tell people to vote for Donald Trump?
I'm not shy to personally say yes. I'm going to tell everyone who asks, and some people that don't ask me, yes, I'm voting for Donald Trump. I think you should vote for Donald Trump. I think the question sometimes people are asking is, should we as a church endorse Donald Trump as our preferred candidate? That's kind of a different issue depending on what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to endorse anyone from the stage, mostly because of what I believe the pulpit exists for, right. And that is the propagation of the gospel, the discipleship of believers, heralding the good news of Jesus Christ for the good of God's people and the glory of God. And so I think that a Sunday morning sermon, while I do plan to, the week of the election, do a sermon on politics, because I believe that in cultural moments we need to discuss it. It's not specifically to endorse any candidate. It's not specifically to tell people what to do. But it's important for us to understand that the separation of the pulpit from political matters is a contemporary thing.
Yeah.
If you look back on history, there has not been in the history of the church a separation between the pulpit and politics the way that it is today. I mean, I've seen David Schrock post a volume of sermons, and I don't have this volume, but I want it, of political sermons in American history, and how in the beginning and the formation of the United States all the way up through Civil War era, where pastors did use the bully pulpit to push political issues, to push their cultural influence to get society to go a specific way on politics. And I do think that that is one way in which we do herald the good news of Jesus Christ, because Jesus is Lord over the political arena. Now, I think that you should, and as blunt as I am, I do think that you can be nuanced in these issues. And what I mean by that is, do I think you should tell people to vote for Donald Trump? In a sense, yes. If anybody asks me, which so few people do, and I think it's because they know the answer. Of course, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. But if somebody comes to me and says, "Should I vote for Donald Trump?" I'm not just going to say yes. I'm going to give you a list of reasons. I'm going to engage why do I believe the Christian worldview necessitates your vote at this particular time with these particular issues and this particular moment of cultural insanity. Why should we vote a specific way, and why does your vote need to be for Donald Trump for this cultural moment? I think preventing the left from obtaining power is the wisest choice that you can make in our society. And so I don't feel any hesitancy in saying that. It's not even a close call to me.
Yeah, and I think, and here's what I will say, this idea that pastors should be closed off from their people about how they're voting. I've seen so many people say, your people shouldn't even know how you're voting, pastor. That's silly for so many reasons. One is just the obvious. It's not even a close call. The left needs to not be in political power. That's not good for the church. Also, it's fake.
Yeah.
There's just an element of that's not healthy, actually.
Yeah, and there's a guy over at Southern Seminary. I think he's nothing more than a librarian with a PhD, but he keeps talking about how it's not Baptist to do certain things. And I think that's foolish, because what's not Baptist is this ivory tower separation of the priesthood that I see so many academic seminarian Baptist making right now, and it's nothing more than soy boy cowardice. And so what actually is Baptist is this great belief and this great history of propagating the priesthood of believers. And what that means is there's a great equality where grace is concerned among all believers. And so I am not separated out from the priesthood of believers simply because I am a pastor. There's no need to construct an ivory tower where the pastor has to separate himself off from the culture of the sheep below. What a pastoral office is that exactly. It is an office that I inhabit, that you inhabit, that all 6 pastors of Village Church inhabit, but we ourselves are still members of Village Church. We are still disciples within Village Church. We are still disciple makers within Village Church. And so I actually push back, and I would say there's nothing more Baptist that you could do where not just the autonomy of your church is concerned, but also where the priesthood and equality amongst all believers is concerned, than to have open and honest political discussions with your people. Because in the United States, that's the most pressing issue where discipleship is right now, is how do you think politically?
Yeah. I see no issue, just to kind of wrap that question up, no issue being honest about that. I'm not hesitant about my vote this election cycle. We can talk more about that for the reasons why. You already mentioned the big one. I don't think the left should have power, but people ask, we're going to tell them, you should vote for Donald Trump in this election. And even I would go a step, it's important that you do, as we'll continue on as we go through these questions. All right, next question. Is politics part of the mission of the church?
I think it has to be. In one sense, there are clearly political implications to living as a Christian and maturing as a Christian. You cannot divorce that away. But specifically in the United States, we have a representative democracy. And so our republic requires the involvement of people in changing the tides of culture or maintaining the tides of culture. We are not in a society that separates politics from the people. And so if you're a disciple of Christ, especially in our nation, this is true of any nation, but especially in our nation, you wield political authority. You wield power. And so part of discipleship is, how do you wield that responsibility to maintain, to make better the culture around you, to be what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, to be the salt of the earth, to be the light, to be the city on the side of the hill. How do you do that? And so making disciples means gaining wisdom in all areas. Yeah. And that's especially true of politics.
Yeah. To me, it really depends on how you phrase this question. Is politics the mission of the church?
Right.
Well, no. Great Commission, dominion mandate. These are like things that have been given to the church. But is politics a part of the mission of the church? That's a different question. And then, of course, everything you just said, as much as it is a part of everyone's life, then it has to be.
Well, especially if you throw the dominion mandate in there,
right?
There's no way to obey the dominion mandate without being political.
Yeah.
Because the dominion mandate necessitates being fruitful and multiplying, and so that asks the question of, how am I setting up a society? How am I influencing society so that people can be fruitful and multiply? If we believe that there is still part of our mission is to first and foremost raise Christian families, which, if you don't think that you have a mission to raise Christian families, then you're disobeying Scripture right there to begin with in your motivation. But that means that in our country, we can cultivate a culture in which it makes having children easier. Mm-hmm. It makes raising a family more streamlined. It makes raising a family more popular. It makes raising a family easier where our society is concerned. And right now, there's only one side of this debate that you can look at and say, wow, it really does make obeying the dominion mandate attainable.
Yeah.
And so it has to be part of the mission of the church. We have to engage in politics.
Yep. The Bible speaks to all aspects of life, and so it's foolish to think that we can just avoid this one. Do we have an obligation to vote?
Yes. If there's two people that I see a large scale where Christians are concerned, that are trying to make an argument that we do not have an obligation to vote, that not voting is this mushy middle ground that you can stand in and not sink into it. And that's on one side. You have leftists who don't want to admit that they support Democrats and progressives. And then on the other side, you have what I think are actually phony abolitionists, these idealistic people. It's a take it or leave it where abortion causes are concerned, and they're so idealistic that practically they're useless, and they're Gnostic in their defense of not voting if somebody's not 100% acceptable according to their standards, and on day one they won't end all abortion everywhere for all time. Both of those camps want to believe that not voting is okay, but if you take seriously, like I was just talking about, things like the Dominion mandate, if you take seriously education, if you take seriously family, I mean, even in our cultural moment right now, where if we don't elect people who will further righteousness and soul in society, we are very quickly just one generation away from losing the nation. And I really believe that. At minimum, you have to admit it is unwise, it is foolish to not use the power that God gives you in voting. But the question that I always challenge people with, and this is from the book of Proverbs, is how unwise can you be before you are sinning?
That's it.
And I think not wielding your power to vote is at least that far.
Yeah, if you want to kind of say, well, does that really mean I have an obligation to vote? Are you telling me you want to be unwise? You want to be a bad steward with the power, and we need to not be afraid of that word, the power God's given you in a constitutional republic. You're like, well, that's nice that God gave me that, but I think I'll just be unwise on this one. You have to make an argument that it's wise to not use the influence God has given you, and I don't see any way you can make that argument.
I mean, that's one of the things for me is so great about the United States is this constitutional republic, is that on paper, at least, our nation is by the people, for the people.
For now.
That the power is in the hands of the people. And if you have that stewardship, by not using that stewardship, you are being a fool. And so then you go to the extent where people are like, well, brother, God's will is going to happen anyway. That's just apathy.
Yeah.
Being apathetic about politics is foolishness. There's no justification for it.
Yeah. It's even a form of hyper-Calvinism, too, to talk about that. I think we are the means also to God's ends. And
it's fatalism.
Yeah, it's foolish. People at this point are going to ask, well, okay, so I have to vote. What about voting for a third party? For me, I'm not going to give a blanket condemnation for that in all cases, because I do think there is a case to be made. Hey, here's a strategic decision. I'm going to vote for this person that I know can't win. However, I still go back to the unwise and foolish. In this particular situation, in this particular time, when you look at the left and you look at the right, and you're looking at two directions for our country, is me just stepping out of that debate and saying, I'm going to make a point by, voting for some idealistic candidate that can't win. I don't see any way to look at this right now and say that's the time for that.
No, it's not the time for that. I mean, I remember years ago when this third party push happened amongst all idealistic, professing Christians. And in the 2016 election cycle, that's what brought about this whole push that now you're seeing closeted Democrats get behind them, like Anya Bwile, like Karen Pryor, which they're nothing more than closeted Democrats, but they're making this push for the American Solidarity Party. I remember when a bunch of foolish Acts 29 guys tried to make that push too. And what's been found out over the last year is that the American Solidarity Party is nothing more than communism.
They're communist.
And libertarians are nothing more than basement dwellers who really just want to allow drugs and abortion to run rampant because they just want freedom with no morality constraining it, which is nothing more than anarchy. And neither of those is wise. If you are a parent, you understand neither of those things is wise.
I think a third-party vote, a time to consider that is if your two choices are not drastically different, and whichever one comes into power, it's always going to make a difference, but isn't going to make a big difference, then perhaps that's a time to make a statement with the third party. That is not the choice that we're facing.
And I'll tell you, I have no problem shepherding our people to just tell them, look, you must choose one of two. Those are the only viable options. And it's not, and I hate this perspective, and it's not just because I'm just, I believe in the power of positive thinking. It's not just because I'm an optimist. Stop acting like you have to choose the lesser of two evils and throwing some stupid Charles Spurgeon quote at me where he wasn't even talking about that specific issue to begin with. No, it's about choosing the better of two choices. Yeah. And right now you have two choices, and it's just so glaringly obvious which is the better. John MacArthur in the past couple of days has said that this is probably the easiest election that he can remember where the choice is so obviously easy.
To be clear, and we've said this in our last podcast, the right must win. I mean, that's our stance. We do not want the left to come to power. It's not good for our families, for the church, for society. We need to vote proactively for the right to come to power.
Absolutely. When we think about these questions, some people have asked a couple of different questions the same way, and it's basically, what about the separation of church and state? What about, shouldn't we stay out of politics? I mean, we had somebody disrupt a service a while ago because I was talking about the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and I was talking about the statement that Nate just said, just that the right must win, and we're dealing with that more than ever. And there's a couple of things about this whole separation of church and state thing is really important for people who are not well versed in the issue, and it's just they're going on sentiment that they've gained over the years. First and foremost, separation of church and state is not even in our Constitution. It was in a letter written by Thomas Jefferson, and it was just his opinion. Yeah. And so that's not codified really into law. I mean, what Jefferson even was fighting for was a wall of separation so that the state could not interfere in the church, not so that the church could not have influence where the government and the state was concerned. He basically didn't want a leader of the nation to ordain himself as the Pope. And that's great. Yeah. I would say that too. There's clearly a separation. I believe in those three spheres where it's the government, where it's the family, and where it's the church. And there's certain places where those things might intersect a little bit, but by and large, the problem that we're facing today is that the state wants to be God over the family and over the church for evil purposes, for satanic purposes. And so every voter in America is advocating for some form of religious belief. Yeah. And basically, I really think this. You can boil it down to two separate entities. You are either advocating for secularism or you are advocating for theism in all things. In every election you have, you are advocating for one or the other. You cannot separate religion and the state because legislation is literally a battlefield of morality. Every act of legislation is an act of morality. Every act of legislation is some attempt to restrain some definition of immorality. The question then becomes, who gets to define the difference between morality and immorality? If secularism gets to define the difference between morality and immorality, then it will be immorality that reigns because secularism must stop theism. That's its goal. And by what standard are we going to have morality defined by? Well, the secular state's definition of morality is whatever they find expedient. Abortion then becomes very moral. Thievery through taxes becomes very moral. And I saw a case just a little while ago where, and this is where we are in society, where there was a murder of a toddler in a grocery store parking lot by a woman who had been supposed to have been held for mental health issues because she was told she was a danger to herself, danger to society. But a judge decided that she should walk free before her mental health evaluation took place. And just a few days later, she murdered a toddler. Then she goes back into the system. And the system then said she's unfit to stand trial. And then another one happened in Vegas where a former police chief was run over by two gang members. Put in prison, about to face trial. deemed unfit to stand trial because they didn't understand the consequences of their actions. And I don't think people are thinking through those types of consequences of secularism.
I don't think people understand how radically religiously evil the left is. And I think we're still in this mindset, and it's from a kind of libertarian 60s, 70s, 80s of, oh, we're trying to allow for immorality. That's not what's happening. The left is trying to define what is bad as good. And so you see it in the way they talk about it. They don't think that they're trying to loosen up morals and we're being, less moral. And no, they think that actually abortion is a good thing. They think all the LGBT perversion is a good thing. It's very different than, oh, we're just letting them sin. No. They think it's good.
And you can look at it and define why they think it's good, and it's because secularism is satanic.
Yeah.
And so be fruitful and multiply. Abortion, that is the opposite of be fruitful and multiply. LGBTQ, that's the opposite of the nuclear family.
And to understand how dangerous that is, like that, it means they're coming for your kids. That's what's at stake.
We see that happening right now in certain cases where in Michigan, if your child, and of course, not in Michigan, it's in Michigan, but it's also in Minnesota, and that's where the guy running for vice president with Democrats, Walz, that is where he is the governor. They have on law that if your child wants to transition and you seek to stop your child, CPS can come in and begin proceedings to remove that child from your family. Do you know how dangerous that is?
This is how stark I want to make this. It is on the table because that law is real. They are taking kids away from families who do not promote LGBT perversion. If you do not cast an effective vote up and down from president to dog catcher for the right to take power, you are in some sense with the stewardship God has given you responsible for that evil.
Yeah, absolutely. I can tell you without any type of qualification, Kamala Harris is an evil woman. Tim Walz is an evil man. The problem with Tim Walz is he's also obviously a sexual deviant. He's a pervert.
Very clear.
And so if you don't do what's necessary to stop them, then we have to have a longer conversation about what is your faith about. We need to have that conversation.
Yeah. Pastors are not getting more political. Politics is getting more spiritual and theological and religious. And that's why this is, we're having these conversations more. But it's not that anything really has changed. It's just that we're up against a competing religion.
Yeah, until the last 20 years, maybe not even 20 years, I guess 20 years, we go back to just 2004. I forget how old I am at this point. But if you go back to just 20 years ago, before that, politics really respected the spheres of authority. I mean, that was such a juggernaut of influence on society where you've got the state, you've got the church, you've got the family. These spheres with separate realms of authority. Over the last 20 years, the state has made the decision that they do not respect those other spheres. And so what does the state try to do? Well, the state takes over the family. And we've seen some well-meaning aspects where Child Protective Services is concerned to really help children. What the state has done is now they've turned that into a makeshift Gestapo in order to enforce families to allow immorality. But where the church is concerned, and this is why COVID was such an eye-opening moment for pastors, and it should have been. But pastors are so naive, and pastors have been so enveloped by this third way mentality, which really is nothing more than an excuse for your cowardice. Tim Keller, in retrospect, was a harmful influencer over pastoral ministry where politics are concerned. We can say that now. We can do the post-mortem.
Legacy's bad.
And say, he had a very unhelpful legacy and he has borne terrible fruit. And COVID-19 was nothing more than proof of that, where the government decided, now, we will not just wield the authority where if the church catches on fire, then we have the authority to come in and put the fire out. No, what the government said was we're going to take authority before there ever is a fire so that we can maintain, just in case there's a fire, how you maintain worship where your church is concerned. And that's an overreach. That's tyranny, and it is pastor's responsibility. And I think at first we didn't know what to do, so we closed for a few weeks because we thought maybe everybody was going to die. But then when we found out, oh no, we're not going to die, We just started having services again, and I don't think people understand the tyranny that they tried to exercise over us when we were meeting in the summer of 2020, in the fall of 2020, all the way up through 2021. We had over a dozen times where the health department tried to initiate proceedings to shut us down, and we just said no. And thank God, because of the Constitution that our forefathers put into place and the amendments to the Constitution, there was nothing that they could do. But here's the key. They tried. Mm-hmm. And if we hadn't just dug our heels in and said, no, we're going to keep doing whatever we want to do, we're not going to make anybody wear a mask, we're not going to make anybody social distance, they would have loved to have taken the authority to become the Pope of Village Church. And so those things are at stake. Third way, and what third way really is, if you don't know, it's this way of saying there's some good on the right, there's some good on the left, and so you just need to find a place in the middle where you take the good elements of both. That was so naive, because what has happened is now it's so obvious there is no good on the left, not a bit of good on the left. And so what pastors are doing is they're still trying to maintain this already failed ideal and kind of just propagate and become the kind of this opiate for people who don't want to be the salt of the earth. It's not just naive. It is an abdication of your responsibility to wield influence well.
Yep. You think you don't have to pick a side, but you do.
Yeah.
Some of these questions are going to start to blend together, and that's okay. It's just the nature of what we're doing here. But should the church stay out of politics and focus on evangelism?
Not if they understand evangelism and politics correctly.
Yeah.
Because politics is what makes evangelism in a free and open society possible to begin with. Try to evangelize in the Sudan right now, where there is no moral influence, and you're probably going to get decapitated. And so we in the United States, because we were started as a nation with Christian influence, you have to at least admit that. We were started as a society where evangelism is possible, and that is why I can freely talk about Jesus Christ with all of my neighbors with zero fear that the government is going to arrest me for doing that. At the beginning of our nation, that was a tough subject that had to be overcome, but we overcame it. But also understand that the same Jesus that you're talking about, where the good news is concerned, where his message of redemption through faith is concerned, that is the Lord over evangelism, is the Lord over politics. And so a lot of where evangelism is concerned, I think people put this wall of separation between evangelism and discipleship that shouldn't really exist. Alan Hirsch made the statement years ago that you have to ask the question, when does discipleship start? And for most people, it's the moment that you come to faith in Christ. And he challenges that notion because that's not really what Scripture says. What Scripture says basically is that evangelism is discipleship. And so discipleship starts at the moment of first contact with Jesus. And so then evangelism necessitates the ability to answer questions about the political sphere, because at what point do you begin to answer questions? Okay, now that I'm a Christian, how do I function in a free society?
It's this thing that we talk about all the time. At what point are you going to tell them really everything that following Jesus involves? Because it's this idea that people think evangelism is just getting everyone to think you're nice. We've talked about this before on the podcast quite a bit, and that's not evangelism. So we need to tell people, yes, we're inviting you into worshiping and following a God who demands your whole life. And he's going to change your whole life, and that includes Christian morality in the public sphere. So that can't be separated from evangelism.
And this is why I think some of the work that Francis Schaeffer did towards the end of his life was so vital and so important. He takes an entire section of the God who is there. I think that was the book that I'm talking about, but where he talks about this concept, and he was such a forerunner of this where postmodern society was concerned. He had these conversations before anybody else, where he came up with the concept of pre-evangelism. So what Hirsch would say is discipleship at the first moment of contact with Jesus, Francis Schaeffer would have called it pre-evangelism, because we live in a society now where you almost have to convince someone truth exists before the good news becomes good, where you have to convince somebody that reality itself is objective before you can ever get to the point where Jesus is Lord over all. And those are extremely political matters.
Yeah.
Just making the statement, truth exists, that's a political statement. The statement, reality is objective, that's a political statement.
Yeah.
They're not merely political statements, but they are political statements. And so that means that evangelism is political in nature.
Yeah. I think this question also presupposes that we're only talking about evangelizing the left,
Yeah.
which is a big issue because the right is mostly unsaved too. And so as we engage politics on the right and say, hey, this needs to line up with Christian morality and that's best for society, there's a whole group of Christless folks on the right that we are evangelizing. And so that shouldn't be ignored either.
Yeah, I can't remember the name of the pastor that said this, but when we some people, when they talk about the difference between politics and evangelism, they'll quote Jesus when he took the coin and he said, whose picture's on this coin? And he said, Caesar. And he said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and God's who is God's. And they're like, see, that separates politics and even your Christianity. And the missed notion that Jesus is making inference of is that what Jesus is talking about is greater than money. Jesus is talking about what does belong to God. You belong to God. You were made in his image. You are God's. But not just that. Jesus is actually making the statement, Caesar belongs to God. Mm-hmm. And so Jesus was the Lord over Caesar. Jesus is the Lord over politics. And so even when you get down to, okay, giving the money to Caesar, that's fine. It's got his picture on it. Well, that doesn't remove taxes from the sphere of Christianity because Jesus is Lord over that too. And if you use it unrighteously, you are in sin and you will be judged for that as a government leader. And so there is no part of discipleship, I think, that you can remove from the political arena.
Yep, absolutely. All right, this next question, a little bit snarky, I think, but I'll allow it because I know what they're saying. Why is it okay to vote for immoral people?
Well, and of course you can get snarky as a Christian with this too, and be like, there is no one without sin.
Right, they're all immoral.
Who hasn't sinned? If you're a good, at least where soteriology is concerned, Calvinist, you would just look at them and say, well, total depravity. And so there has never been a presidential candidate on any side that has ever been without sin. Yeah. And so Jesus isn't on the ballot is the way that a lot of people would put this. Is like there is no perfect person. And you're also sort of turning politics into this Gnostic realm where you're over-spiritualizing voting and giving it almost too much significance in that even though you do obviously have two sinners running for political office, you can get down to the application of practical matters and say, well, which one of those two sinners is advocating for more righteousness than the other? Yeah. And I would say that's patently obvious in this election.
I mean, I think anyone is going to say, I wish we had an ideal regenerate Christian candidate, and even then they're going to be immoral, but that they would be a regenerate Christian, knows Christ, follows him, seeks to repent when he sins. Like that would be an ideal candidate. No one is going to deny that. That's not where we're at in our culture right now. And so that kind of question is like, are you just saying withdraw and don't participate? Well, obviously things we've already said, no. So that means that you're going to have to make a choice in a direction. And so I don't view it as voting for an immoral person. I view it as making a choice between some options.
Yeah, your question is going to be, who's going to take the United States in a better direction?
Yeah.
And again, I don't think that's a difficult one to answer right now.
Yeah. This next one kind of follows right along with that, but a little different twist. Why do conservatives no longer believe that character matters? I reject that premise off the start. They do, but what I just said. Character does matter, of course, but there's different kinds of character, and the perfect candidate with the perfect character is not an option that we have right now. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter.
You have to support right-wing politics, and because that's more righteous. That's the one where character does at least matter. And that's what you have to understand is that if you're a conservative, you have to ask the question, what are you trying to conserve?
Yeah.
Well, you're trying to conserve morality in soul and society. And yes, we have the best of two options right now. Is someone that's been divorced, is somebody that has some sketchy stuff in his past. But that in no way devalues not just what he has said, because this is one thing that's changed from 2016 to 2024, is that in 2016, what all of the squishy third wayers were saying is, oh, Donald Trump is a liar. He's not going to do any of the good stuff. He's just itching your ears. He's telling you all this. Fast forward to the end of his first term, and were there mistakes that happened during his first term? Absolutely. I think COVID was not handled well by him at the end of his first term. He's admitted as much, though. But you also have to admit that he put us on a great trajectory where stewardship was concerned, where money was concerned, where national debt was concerned. But here's the other key, and this is what a lot of people that want to kind of minimize his what he did where abortion was concerned, is that he was able to appoint 2 Supreme Court justices that all Christians approved of. He did exactly what he said he was going to do. And this is not said enough. Donald Trump is personally responsible for Roe versus Wade being struck down. If you disagree with that, you're either ignorant or you are lying. He's personally responsible for that. And I know that a lot of people were disappointed when and I forget if this is something we're going to talk about. We're actually going to talk about this in the next question. So let's go ahead and get to that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, just to wrap up the last one, I just think it should be said that one character issue is supporting left-wing politics.
Yeah.
So people have this idea that, President Obama was at least a man of good character.
President Obama's going to hell unless he repents and trusts the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Even compared to, Joe Biden's been senile his whole presidency. We have not had a more evil president, I don't think, than Barack Obama.
No.
So just because he dressed well and, gave good speeches and seemingly has an intact family, that doesn't make him a man of good character. And so it's a question. I
think one of the big differences that we see with Donald Trump than anybody else, for my entire life, politicians presented well and then just either lied or did immoral stuff behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Without exception.
On the right, too.
Yeah, on the right and the left, without exception. Yeah. Is that all of these people were just as immoral or more immoral in some senses, but they just looked really good doing it and hiding it from the public eye. What happened when somebody like Donald Trump came into play is that this is a guy, and I appreciate this. This is a guy that just wears it.
Yeah.
This is a guy that's just honest about it. This is a guy that does not filter. This is a guy that does not hide anything behind the scenes. He leads with who he really is. And yes, who he really is, it kind of chides against your morals in some senses, but then he doesn't do any shady business behind the scenes the way that other people did. Barack Obama smiled at you and then made society wicked and evil.
Yeah.
He ramped up the evil in society by about 1,000 years within his 8-year term, and you were just too stupid to notice it.
Yep. All right. So this is a big question. How can we vote for a pro-abortion and pro-LGBT person like Donald Trump?
And that's what I almost started answering in the last question. Is it was shameful in a sense, because there's 2 senses to talk about it here. In one sense, I know that the fight for abolishing abortion, which, by the way, I'm an abolitionist, you're an abolitionist. If you're a Christian, you have to be an abolitionist. You have to fantasize and dream about a day where there is no more abortion in society, which, by the way, is different than dealing with ectopic pregnancies, is different than dealing with miscarriages. If you don't know the difference, read a book. But they removed pro-life language from the Republican platform. I think that was a mistake at best. That was a mistake. But what a lot of pastors who have just been getting overly emotional, there's nothing worse than being overly emotional about these issues rather than sticking to the mere facts. What they miss with the Trump presidency is the reason that he took it out of the platform is because, and I think he's flawed in this belief, he believes he won. So in a sense, it's removed because that was his way of taking a victory lap. Again, I don't think he's won on this issue, and I do think he's backtracked in order to be more politically expedient on abortion issues. But here's the key. He keeps making statements like, I pushed it back to the states. That's what we wanted, because that's a strategy in incrementalism getting towards abolitionism. And I have no fear of informing you that I think the wisest path towards abolition is incrementalism, because it's kind of silly to think that you're just going to get rid of it all overnight. And so it's like chopping down a tree, one swing at a time. You got to take it out one swing at a time. And he's right in the sense that there are states now, and there's continuing to be states on the ballot where they're outlawing abortion, and there's liberal states where they're going to put it on the laws. That's the truth. And that means that we as Christians have a lot of work to do. But here's what I want you to understand just about the abortion issue, and then we can talk about the LGBTQ issues. But where abortion is concerned, we went from Reagan to Bush to Clinton to Bush to Bush, okay? And so if we take Clinton out of that scenario, we got a lot of Bushes and we've got Reagan. If you don't understand that Donald Trump did more for abortion than any Bush ever did and any Reagan ever did, then you don't understand politics. The Reagan and the Bushes did nothing to stop abortion. They just told you what you wanted to hear. And here's why Christians can become naive where society is concerned, is that I think some people just are more comforted by hearing than seeing someone actually do something. And so I'm seeing a lot of abolitionists who are so self-centered that they're not giving Trump any credit for striking Roe v. Wade down. That brought us way further than anybody in the Republican Party has ever taken us.
The reality is our culture's in a terrible spot where abortion is concerned. We're finding out it's more evil than we ever knew. We're finding out people on the left care about it more than we even realize, which is bad. But
the only reason any woman is voting for Kamala Harris is so that she can murder a baby. Think about that as a society.
It's terrible. And there's too many people on the right that don't care enough about this. The fact that it even has a chance of not... Florida's on the line. That's crazy that Florida may vote to enshrine abortion. So I just say that's not an excuse for Donald Trump. He should have the correct policy there, and he doesn't. But... I don't believe he's a regenerate believer, most likely. I don't know that for sure, but it sure doesn't look like it. And so why would I expect him to have the exact right policy on this issue?
Yeah, we don't think that Trump could pass our membership interview. That's what we're trying to say.
Right.
It's like, at the end of the day, I don't know the condition of anyone's soul.
Yeah.
But from what I see, do I think that he would pass the membership interview at Village Church? No.
So similar with the LGBT issue, I don't like that he, doesn't want to ban that stuff from society. That would be the Christian position.
But yesterday, he made the statement that he will sign an executive order that will ban gender affirming or what I like to call genital mutilation surgery of minors in the United States. So you've got one side that wants to mutilate the genitals of all minors in society, as many as possible. Tim Walz just drooling over it. On the other side, you've got someone that at least is willing to say, we got to stop this stuff where minors is concerned. Yeah. Which way, Christian?
Yeah, and
which way?
Yesterday he also invited Christians to the table. He said, I want you to have a voice here. That's way more than we're getting on the left. And so, do I expect him to not be okay with some pride stuff if he thinks it's not hurting anyone? He's wrong in his worldview, but I'm not surprised by it. But it's a drastic difference from the left, and it's the choice that we have right now. And I'll tell you, we're not winning that cultural issue right now. The church needs to speak up. I mean, I can't even get pastors to speak up about the LGBT stuff in our public schools. And I think Trump's going to do something about it.
Yeah, we have Southern... I mean, think about this. We have Southern Baptist pastors in the Richmond area loading their children on school buses every day to be shipped to an indoctrination center by people who are posting pride flags on their rooms as allies. And if you think Donald Trump is a problem, and you're a member of one of these churches, and you're not confronting your pastor on this issue, then you're a weak, limp-wristed coward.
I am going to use the opportunity to say this as often as I can. We found, and when I say we, I mean actually me personally, but others online found gay pornography in Chesterfield Elementary School libraries, and no one cares.
Yeah.
That's where we're at.
It's where we're at. And not just that, but we were the only people to speak out about it. And think about the condition of Southern Baptists, conservatives of Virginia, which is, I don't even think they can claim that anymore. Think about the fact that they claim to be conservatives, but they're afraid of upsetting the public school teachers in our area to where they won't confront this radical evil and soul in society.
Anyway, you want to get us talk about that issue. Yeah. All right. Last question. Shouldn't we keep religion out of politics?
In a sense, we've already answered this question where you can't.
Yeah.
I mean, you can never do that. Politics involves religion. Religion must interact with politics because Jesus is Lord over politics.
Yep. We've said it already, like I said, but all legislation is moral. That's just a fact. The left is trying to legislate evil and call it good. Scripture speaks specifically to that and what a bad thing that is. We got to fight it. The right must win.
Absolutely. The right must win. The idea that the public square is in some sense neutral where faith and God are concerned is a myth. There is no such thing as neutrality.
So be crystal clear on this. No, we are not going to get up at the pulpit and do political endorsements, because you started the podcast off saying, I don't believe that is the place for that. But personally, if you ask us, I want you to go out and vote straight ticket Republican, which is what the right is right now, this election season. That's Absolutely. What I want you to do. I hate that we have to call it a season. Wish it was a day, but it's a season.
Yeah. Vote for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Citizen Steve
right.
Says that you've got to vote for him. You got to vote for J.D. Vance in Virginia. You got to vote for Hung Cao. You got to get Tim Kaine out of office. He's a fake. He's a phony. He's a terrible person. And so we've got to unseat every Democrat from political office, because that's where we are, where society is concerned. Well, we thank you for joining us on the special edition of the Converge podcast. Hey, if you're a part of one of those churches where your pastor never speaks about politics, we're trying to keep your limp-wristed coward of a pastor accountable for being a man, stepping up and actually saying something. And we thank you for joining us, and we hope you have a good day.